The government's Water Resources Minister, Joshua Burgoyne, he has today unveiled the long-awaited Mataranka Water Allocation Plan. But the government has also today scrapped the previous water allocation plan for the Western Davenport region and replaced it with a brand new one. To tell us about these decisions, our guest on the Country Hour today is the Water Resources Minister, Joshua Burgoyne. Minister, thank you for your time. There's lots to talk about here. Let's start with the 2024-2034 Western Davenport Water Allocation Plan, because this decision has raised a few eyebrows. Can you explain to our audience what the government has done here?
Absolutely, Matt. This is an important district in the Northern Territory as it relates to water resources. Well, the Western Davenport, just in the Central Plains area alone, holds 138 million megalitres of water. Now, what the previous government did is that there was a water allocation plan in place for about 87,000 megalitres. They reduced that by 20,000 megalitres, not based on science, but they did this 2 days before caretaker as a result of what they believed were community concerns. Now, what we want to do here with our government is be very clear in regards to the direction we're heading. We are trusting in the science, and what's come back to me in regards from the department is that 87,700, the original declaration, is what is sustainable for that yield. And I want to be really clear here for all listeners. That protects 99.4% of the aquifer under the ground over 10 years. So over 10 years, less than 1%, 0.6% of the groundwater storage is going to be utilised if all that 87,000 megalitres was used year after year, which we know right now there's less than 10,000 megalitres being utilised.
I can go straight to a question from our audience because it's about this. The question was, why does the NT government keep quoting the 0.6% figure when stakeholders and scientists all agree that storage volumes is meaningless? It's the groundwater levels that matter.
And I think this is something, Matt, that when we talk about this, we need to be really clear. There is a vast underground system of water in the Western Davenport's area. The scientists have said very loudly and very clearly to me, and you've had them on this show, stating this is the amount of water that can be sustainably yielded from that aquifer. So we can all sit down and we can argue about the science. The reality is we want to send a clear message, and there is always going to be people looking at this, ensuring that there is that any changes in the water table and all this into the future is done. But what we are doing here today is ensuring that the science is what is essentially guiding our decisions, not activists. And that's a really important message to send as a government.
Because the reason why irrigation expansion got squashed around the tea tree area years ago is because they worked out that while there was lots of water there, if you started taking too much, the groundwater level drops, and all of a sudden all those trees, I'm probably dumbing it down a bit here, but essentially the roots couldn't reach the water. So even though you've got this huge amount of water down there, if you drop that table too much, it doesn't matter how much is there.
And what I
don't understand is how that does not apply just down the road there at Western Davenport.
What is really clear to explain to people here is when you draw down water in a certain area, it does not draw down the entire area at the same rate. It's what's been described to me as a bit of a bell curve. So we can talk about drawdowns, we can talk about all these things and get into the nitty-gritty. At the end of the day, the scientists have said this is how much water can be sustainably yielded from this aquifer, and we are going with that. And I think this is really important. We're not trying to win a few votes here. We are ensuring that the science is what we are basing our decisions on in the future. And the Western Davenport is an important area, but the reality is there are very few people there right now utilising the water. And we need to ensure that in the future we give a surety to industry, but we also say to people loudly and clearly, we're protecting 99%, over 99% of that aquifer for the environment. And I don't think that gets talked about enough.
The previous water allocation plan, as you said, it came out just before the election, and your predecessor, Kate Warden, said the decision to reduce the amount of water available was done because during consultation, members of the Western Davenport Water Advisory Committee suggested that exploring the option of reducing the estimated sustainable yield to address concerns including concerns by the traditional owners. And so that's why the decision was made. Why bin that? Why bin those concerns?
Everyone can have concerns, Matt. And at the end of the day, I completely acknowledge those concerns. But when the scientists come to us and say this is how much water can be sustainably yielded, that is what we are doing. And if you want to talk about Aboriginal people and traditional custodians, they were some of the biggest losers when it came to the reduction of that 20,000 megalitres. Under the new allocation plan for the Western Davenport, the Aboriginal water reserve is going to be back up to 25,000 megalitres per year. So when we actually look, so often people come onto this show, they talk about real jobs out in community, they talk about real jobs in regional areas. This is how we enable that, by ensuring that there's water there. And another area of work that we need to do is ensure that if Aboriginal people want to trade that water that they have, they can. So they can make real money and essentially provide for their families into the future. And if they want to start up an agricultural project themselves, there's water available for them to do so. And I think that's something that, again, gets overlooked. They were the big losers when the previous minister reduced the water allocation by 20,000 megalitres. We're giving that water back into the Aboriginal Water Reserve, which is important as well.
The decision to scrap the old plan, bring in this new one, what consultation did you do with that Water Advisory Committee?
Matt, I want to be really clear here. This is something that's been spoken about for years. There was a previous water allocation plan in place. The minister, 2 days before caretaker, reduced it by 20,000 megalitres. Now, you could argue that she did that on the basis of working with the committee. At the end of the day, what we want to ensure going forward is that it's the science that we are basing our decisions on. So I want to be very clear about that.
Does this decision show a lack of confidence in the Water Advisory Committee?
No, and this is something that, again, it was a previous committee that was part of the initial allocation. So to come in and say, oh, well, after they allocated the 87,000, they then decided to reallocate it for 67. I mean, did they not agree with their initial estimates? And I think this is the whole process, is that at times there's been a lot of talk and a lot of heat in regards to this decision. What we're saying loudly and clearly is we're trusting in the science. We're not going to let activists guide in which way when it comes to water resources, we're going to look at the science and ensure that we protect the environment, protect the sustainable yields of these water resources, and give certainty to industry going forward. So that's a really important part of this. And when we look at the Mataranka Water Allocation Plan, again, we're protecting a resource up there, and there are areas where there is no more allocation as a result of this plan being declared.
And I'll get to Mataranka.
You'll get
in a
to
moment.
Mataranka?
Don't worry, we're dedicating plenty of time to water on the Country Hour today.
Good to hear.
Just finally on Western Davenport, what's your vision for what irrigated ag could look like in that area of the Northern Territory?
I think we now have a very clear message from this government. There is a water resource there that can be sustainably utilised. Get on in, develop industry, ensure that you're doing so in a sustainable way, and there is water there for that to occur. I think in the past there was a lot of uncertainty about if a water licence was going to be granted, if enough people made a noise about it, was it then going to be taken off you? What we're saying really loudly and clearly here today is that there is a vast water resource there. We want to protect the environment, but ensure that industry has a clear line of sight over the next 10 years about what water will be available. And there's so much regulation in this space, Matt. I tell you what, I'm proud to be standing here today with these two water allocation plans that protect the environment, but also give industry certainty.
If you're tuning in, this is the Country Hour, and we're speaking to the NT Government's Minister for Water Resources, Joshua Burgoyne. As you just said, there's two water allocation plans that have been declared this week. We've been talking about the Western Davenport Water Allocation Plan. Let's head north now. The Mataranka Water Allocation Plan. This has been talked about for yonks. People on that Water Advisory Committee have been on that committee for, I think it's a decade plus. So now it's out. What can you tell our audience?
Absolutely, Matt. The Mataranka Water Allocation Plan, it covers some 9,000 square kilometres and comprises essentially three management zones, North Mataranka, South Mataranka and Larrimah. So what we're obviously announcing today is of that 32 million megalitres that's available there, the aquifer, there will be a sustainable yield of 62,474 megalitres per year. Now what that means is that in the North Mataranka area, where you have bitter springs, where you have a lot of these sensitive environmental flows, the water's fully allocated. If you were to go today and apply for a licence to the independent water controller, he'd turn around, look at this plan and say, sorry, no more water. We know that in Larrimah, much further south, there is room for water allocation and for industry. So once again, this work, which you're quite right, it's been a long period of time, but it is the first Mataranka water allocation plan for that area. I was driving through Mataranka just recently and spoke to a TO there. I understand the concerns, but what I really want to ensure that people are aware of through this allocation plan is this protects the environment, protects those environmental flows. And when we talk about dry season flows to the Roper River, which is something that gets talked about a lot, this ensures that it preserves 90% of those flows.
The water allocation plan that's now been released, to me, from my eyes, it looks exactly the same as the draft. Is that fair to say?
Oh, look, it is fairly similar, and that's important for people to understand. The water controller, for a long period of time, has been looking at the draft allocation and essentially either granting or not granting licence based on that draft. But he was not going to grant any substantial licences because he was unsure what the final plan was going to be. What this final plan now enables is that if there is a proponent with a large water licence that now needs to be looked at, the independent water controller can have a look at this plan and say, I either can or can't grant that licence based on the water available.
The Northern Land Council said the draft Mataranka Water Allocation Plan was a, quote, failure on all fronts. Your government has pushed ahead regardless. Why?
I think it's really important when we talk about these plans. Again, we are looking at the science. I understand everyone has their views on this, and I was down in Mataranka just recently. I swam in the Bitter Springs. The flows were incredible. Everything was looking amazing. Now, when I talk to some people on the ground, they're saying that they're concerned about certain areas. But when I, again, talk to the scientists, the people who are monitoring these water flows, they are telling me loudly and clearly that the water flows are positive, that they are occurring in there's more water flowing down that Roper River than there has been for years, and we need to ensure that we protect that into the future. What this water allocation plan does today is it ensures that it protects that water into the future, because we won't have additional proponents coming in and taking up more water, and I think that's really important.
And another question from the audience, what's the government's plans for the Flora River? Will there be a water allocation plan for it?
I tell you what, Matt, I'm going to be... I will have to get back to you on the Flora River. I don't know, as I stand here today, whether there's a plan for the Flora River. But again, I think what's really important, and people will say, well, why is there a water allocation plan for one area and not for another? What the government, and this has happened over many, many years, is that there are certain areas that are deemed to be significant as it relates to sensitive areas, but also relates to industry wanting to invest and take water out of the ground. By putting these water allocation plans in, it sets a very clear guidelines about what can be utilised and what can't. And again, up when we're talking about Mataranka...
And without a plan, the government just used to rely on the old 80-20 rule. Exactly
right. And I think, when we look at some of these plans and we're protecting over 90% of the underground aquifer, people can have confidence that we are going to protect the environment and protect these sensitive areas into the future. I really do want to stress that, because I hear what people are saying on the ground. I hear their concerns. But the science says this can happen sustainably and we can protect the environment. That's what's important.
Thanks for sharing time for the Country Hour audience today, Minister. Really appreciate it.